Don't move, they're in position. The words were a ghost of a sound, whispered so close to Gastone Piccio's ear that Alice could feel the warmth of his skin against the cool air of the bistro. She could smell the sharp scent of his espresso and the faint, expensive musk of his Italian leather jacket. Gastone froze, his fork hovering inches from his plate, the silver glinting under the dim chandelier. Because if her training was wrong, she had just blown a 6-month deep-cover operation for nothing. And if she was right, the red laser dot currently dancing across his silk tie was the last thing he would ever see. Alice J. Brooks had been stationed at Leclerc for 12 weeks, and she had survived by adhering to one rigid principle. Follow the protocol. Don't be a hero. Stay invisible. But the cleaners, who had entered the bistro 5 minutes ago, weren't there to bus tables. One was standing too stiffly by the service entrance, his hand hovering near his waistband. The other was adjusting an earpiece hidden behind a heavy collar, his eyes scanning the room with a cold, predatory focus Alice recognized all too well. Alice knew, with the tactical certainty of a top-tier academy graduate, that if Gastone Piccio stood up to leave, the bistro would become a slaughterhouse. The problem was, Gastone Piccio wasn't just a target in a briefing folder. He was the ghost of the city, the man who held the Piccio family together with an iron fist and a terrifying silence. The kind of man an undercover cop was supposed to observe from a distance. The kind of man you definitely didn't protect with your own life. But Alice had already leaned in. She had already broken the first rule of the force. And now, Gastone Piccio was slowly, dangerously, turning his intense gaze toward the waitress who had just saved his life. Gastone didn't hesitate. The moment Alice's warning landed, the air in the bistro curdled with the sudden, sharp scent of ozone and impending violence. He didn't reach for a weapon or shout, he simply shifted his weight, his eyes locked on hers, searching for the lie. He found none, only the cold, calibrated focus of a woman who knew exactly how many seconds they had left. Left, Alice breathed, her voice a steady anchor in the rising tide of panic. The kitchen entrance is 10 paces. Go. The first shot shattered the silence, a high-pitched crack of a suppressed rifle that turned the bistro's vintage mirror into a glittering rain of glass. Gastone moved with a predator's grace, diving low behind the mahogany bar as Alice threw herself down beside him. Another round tore through the leather upholstery where his head had been seconds before. The elegant dining room erupted into chaos, screams of wealthy patrons drowned out by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of professional-grade fire. They have the front and the side street covered, Alice said, her heart hammering against her ribs, though her hands remained stone still. She wasn't a waitress anymore, she was a surveyor of a battlefield. But they're expecting you to go for the armored car out front. They've funneled us. Gastone pulled a sleek Beretta from his waistband, his gaze lingering on the way Alice's eyes scanned the room, identifying cover and blind spots with a precision no server should possess. The service exit, he rasped. It leads to a narrow alley with a grease trap and a dead drop, she whispered, already moving in a low crawl toward the swinging stainless steel doors of the kitchen. The shooters are positioned high. If we stay close to the brick overhang, we're in their blind spot. Follow my lead. They burst through the kitchen doors. Startled chefs dropped pans, the clangor adding to the cacophony. Alice didn't stop. She grabbed a heavy industrial tray and used it as a makeshift shield against the windowed door leading to the alley. A bullet sparked off the metal, the vibration jarring her teeth, but she didn't flinch. Now, she commanded. They plunged into the night air. The alley was a canyon of shadows, smelling of rain and old cardboard. Alice steered him left, away from the tempting open street and toward a rusted iron fire escape. Above them, she heard the frantic footsteps of the hitmen on the roof, their advantage neutralized by the narrow geography she had chosen. Through here, Alice urged, shoving aside a stack of heavy crates to reveal a basement coal chute. It was a tight, undignified squeeze, but it led to the sublevel of the adjacent laundry building. As they slid into the darkness of the basement, the sounds of the shootout faded into a distant, muffled echo. Gastone stood up, brushing the soot from his tailored suit, his chest heaving. He looked at Alice, her hair bun slightly frayed, her bow tie crooked, but her gaze as sharp as a razor. "You're no waitress," Gastone said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble of realization. Alice didn't blink. "I'm the reason you're still breathing, Mr. Piccio. For now, that's all that matters." The silence of the laundry basement was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thrum of industrial dryers overhead. Gastone stood in the center of the dimly lit room, the adrenaline of the shootout still clinging to him like a second skin. He didn't look like a man who had just escaped death, he looked like a man who was recalibrating his entire worldview. His sharp features were cast in deep shadow as he stepped closer to Alice, his intense gaze never leaving her face. "A waitress who understands funneling," Gastone said, his voice a low, melodic threat. "A server who recognizes high ground advantage and tactical blind spots." He reached out, his fingers catching the edge of her black vest, smoothing the fabric with a slow, deliberate motion that felt more like a brand than a gesture of gratitude. "My people are trained for years to do what you just did in 10 seconds. So, Alice J. Brooks, who are you really?" Alice felt the cold weight of her secret pressing against her ribs. She forced her breathing to remain shallow, her expression shifting back into the mask of the humble, observant worker. "I've worked in Newark and Jersey City, Mr. Piccio," she replied, keeping her voice soft but steady. "You learn to watch the doors if you want to stay alive. My father was a security guard. He taught me how to see what others miss." Gastone tilted his head, the scar through his eyebrow twitching. He didn't believe her, but he was fascinated by the lie. He saw the utility in her, a weapon hidden in plain sight, a pair of eyes that the world chose to ignore. "The bistro is a crime scene now," he stated, his eyes narrowing. "You can't go back there. And I don't like leaving debts unpaid. More importantly, I don't like mysteries I can't solve." He stepped into her personal space, the scent of his cologne now mingling with the metallic tang of spent gunpowder. "You're coming with me. My estate in the hills needs staff. Staff who can see a red dot before it finds my heart. You'll be my personal attendant. You'll have a room, a salary that makes that diner look like a charity, and the protection of the Piccio name." Alice hesitated, playing the part of the overwhelmed girl, even as her mind raced with the implications. This was the opening the department had prayed for, total access to the Piccio inner sanctum. But the price was living under the constant, suffocating scrutiny of a man who looked at her like he was trying to dissect her soul. "And if I say no?" Alice whispered. Gastone's lips curved into a ghost of a smile, one that didn't reach his alert, predatory eyes. "Then you walk out that door alone, and we see if the men who attacked me decide you're a witness they can afford to leave behind." "No, Alice. You saved my life. Now, I'm going to keep you where I can see you." He turned toward the exit, expecting her to follow. Alice straightened her bow tie, took a breath of the soot-heavy air, and stepped into the shadow of the man she was born to betray. The cold autumn air in Wequahic Park felt like a physical weight, pressing against Alice's lungs as she sat on a rusted park bench, far from the golden warmth of Gastone's estate. She had traded her silk attendant scarf for a hooded sweatshirt, trying to blend into the shadows of the towering oak trees. The silence was broken only by the crunch of dry leaves. "You're late," a voice rasped from the darkness behind her. Detective Miller stepped into the dim light of a flickering street lamp. His coat was rumpled, and his eyes were tired, the look of a man who had spent too many years chasing ghosts in the Newark underworld. He didn't ask if she was safe or how she was holding up after the shootout. He only wanted the ledger. "He moved me into the estate, Miller," Alice said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "I'm in his inner circle now. But it's a tightrope. He's watching me like a hawk." "Good," Miller replied, his tone devoid of sympathy. "That's exactly where we need you. The Piccio family is fracturing, Alice. We're hearing whispers of a massive shipment coming through the docks, something big enough to shift the power balance in the whole tri-state area. We need dates, locations, and names. He's smart, Alice countered, her mind flashing back to the way Gastone had smoothed her vest in the laundry room, the calculated, possessive weight of his hand. He doesn't keep records in a desk. He keeps them in his head. To get what you want, I'll have to be with him constantly. I'll have to become his shadow. Miller leaned in, the scent of stale coffee and cigarettes clinging to him. Then become his shadow. Sleep in the room next to his. Eat at his table. If he wants a confidant, be his priest. If he wants more, you do whatever is necessary to keep that wire hot. This is the closest we've ever been to taking down the Piccio name. Don't let your protocol get in the way of the win. The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down Alice's spine that had nothing to do with the wind. She thought of her training, the rigid ethics she had been taught at the academy, and how quickly they were dissolving in the face of Miller's ambition. At any cost? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. At any cost, Miller confirmed, his gaze hard and unforgiving. You're an undercover asset, Brooks. The moment you stepped into that bistro, you stopped being a girl with a badge and started being a tool for the department. Use him. Get the intel. And Alice, don't forget which side you're on. He disappeared back into the shadows before she could respond. Alice remained on the bench, the silence of the park suddenly feeling more dangerous than the shootout at the bistro. She was caught between two monsters, one who wanted to use her eyes, and one who wanted to use her soul. As she stood up to return to the estate, she realized the book she had lived by was no longer being written by the police, it was being written by the man waiting for her in the hills. The Piccio estate was a fortress of marble and silence, perched high above the city like a crown of cold stone. Alice had spent a week memorizing its rhythms, moving through the grand hallways with the quiet efficiency of a shadow. Her role as Gastone's personal attendant gave her a unique vantage point. While the security team focused on the perimeter, Alice watched the people within it. She knew the way the staff avoided eye contact, the way the guards shifted their weight when Gastone entered a room, and, most importantly, the way Gastone's brother, Lorenzo, paced the library when he thought no one was looking. Lorenzo was the soft edge of the Piccio blade, younger, louder, and prone to expensive mistakes that Gastone was forced to bury. But as Alice stood on the second-floor balcony, partially obscured by a heavy velvet curtain, she saw a side of him that wasn't soft at all. A black sedan with tinted windows pulled into the rear service courtyard, far from the main gates. Lorenzo was already there, his tailored coat flapping in the wind. He didn't look like a man greeting a guest, he looked like a man meeting a ghost. When the car doors opened, two men stepped out. Alice's breath hitched, her tactical memory firing like a live wire. It was them. The men from the bistro. She recognized the stiff, military gait of the one who had stood by the service entrance, and the cold, sweeping gaze of the one with the earpiece. They were the same predators who had turned the restaurant into a shooting gallery, and here they were, standing on Piccio soil, being greeted with a firm handshake by Gastone's own blood. Alice stepped further back into the shadows, her hand instinctively reaching for the pocket where she kept her encrypted burner phone. Below her, the three men huddled close. Lorenzo was gesturing toward the main house, his face twisted into a mask of frantic ambition. He was showing them the layout, pointing out the vulnerabilities of the very fortress meant to protect his brother. The realization hit Alice with the force of a physical blow. The hit at the bistro hadn't been an external attack, it had been an inside job. Lorenzo hadn't just allowed it, he had orchestrated it. She watched as Lorenzo handed over a thick envelope, the white paper gleaming under the courtyard security lights. It was payment for a job unfinished. As the sedan pulled away and Lorenzo retreated back into the house, Alice felt the world tilt. Her mission had been to find evidence of Gastone's crimes, but she had stumbled into something far more volatile. Gastone wasn't just a target of the law, he was a dead man walking in his own home. Alice knew she had to report this to Miller, but as she turned to leave the balcony, she caught her reflection in the glass. She saw the crisp white shirt and the tight, professional bun, but the eyes looking back at her were no longer those of a cadet. They were the eyes of a woman who was beginning to realize that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one outside the gate, it's the one holding the key. The following evening, the air in Gastone's private study was thick with the scent of aged mahogany and the looming storm outside. Gastone sat behind his desk, the light of a single lamp casting long, sharp shadows across his face. He didn't look up as Alice entered to set down his evening espresso. Instead, he slid a leather-bound folder across the desk toward her. "I have a shipment coming into Pier 17 at midnight," Gastone said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "Medical supplies, officially. But my brother handled the logistics, and after what happened at the bistro, I find I no longer trust his eye for detail." He finally looked up, his gaze pinning her to the spot. "You have a gift for seeing the things that are out of place, Alice. I want you at the docks. If something feels wrong, if the rhythm of the workers is off, or if the crates aren't what they claim to be, you tell me. You are my last line of defense." Alice felt the weight of the folder like a leaden plate. This was the moment Miller had demanded. A single text to her handler would bring a SWAT team swarming onto Pier 17, catching Gastone red-handed and ending his reign. It would be the win her department craved, the justification for every broken rule. But as she looked at Gastone, she saw the weary tension in his shoulders, the silhouette of a man being hunted by his own blood. When she arrived at the docks, the salt spray was cold and biting. She stood on the edge of the pier, watching the crane lower a massive shipping container. Her burner phone was heavy in her pocket. All she had to do was press a single button. But as she watched the shadows, she saw Lorenzo's men positioned in the dark, their eyes not on the cargo, but on the perimeter. They weren't there to protect the shipment, they were waiting for the police to arrive. It was a setup. Lorenzo wanted the police to raid this shipment. He wanted the feds to take Gastone off the board so he could claim the throne without getting his own hands dirty. If Alice called Miller now, she wouldn't be stopping a crime, she would be pulling the trigger for Lorenzo's coup. Alice pulled the phone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the screen. The conflict tore at her, her oath to the law against her growing realization that the law was being used as a weapon by a traitor. She looked at the container, then back at the shadows where Lorenzo's hitmen lurked. Slowly, Alice let the phone slip back into her vest. She turned to the guard Gastone had sent with her. "Tell the boss the shipment is clean," she said, her voice hard and certain. "But tell him the security detail on the north side belongs to his brother. Tell him the trap isn't in the crates, it's in the shadows." She had chosen. She hadn't protected a criminal, she had protected her source. But as she walked back to the car, Alice knew she had crossed a line she could never uncross. She was no longer just an observer. She was playing the game. The following morning, the estate felt like a pressure cooker on the verge of whistling. Gastone had left before dawn to handle the fallout of the dock incident, leaving Alice with a rare window of opportunity. While the house was quiet, she slipped into the west wing, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished marble. She wasn't looking for ledger books or drug manifests this time, she was looking for the paper trail Lorenzo had left behind. In the back of a locked drawer in the library, one that Lorenzo used as a makeshift office, Alice found a stack of parchment that felt too heavy for its size. Using a small penlight, she scanned the documents. Her breath hitched. They were execution orders, dated over the last 3 months, targeting rival capos and even some of Gastone's most loyal lieutenants. At the bottom of each page was the unmistakable, sweeping signature of Gastone Piccio. Alice pulled a magnifying glass from her pocket, her eyes narrowing as she compared the signature to the one on the bistro receipt she had saved. To the untrained eye, they were identical. But Alice noticed the minute hesitation in the ink, a tiny, microscopic shudder at the loop of the P that didn't exist in Gastone's fluid, confident hand. These weren't Gastone's orders. They were forgeries. Lorenzo hadn't just been planning a coup, he had been systematically dismantling Gastone's support system from the inside. By forging these orders, he was making it look like Gastone had become a paranoid, bloodthirsty tyrant, turning his own family against him. He was creating the very chaos he needed to justify stepping up to take control. Alice felt a cold chill wash over her. Every death, every shooting, and every drop of blood spilled in the city over the last 90 days wasn't the result of a mafia war, it was the result of a brother's betrayal. She realized that the medical supplies at the dock weren't just cargo, they were meant to be the final nail in Gastone's coffin, a way to prove he had lost his mind and started stealing from his own people. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the library creaked. Alice froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slid the documents back into the drawer and turned just as the shadows of the hallway shifted. She was no longer just an undercover cop looking for a bust. She was the only person in the world who knew the truth, standing in a house where the walls were closing in and the man she was supposed to arrest was the only person she could trust. She had to get this evidence to Gastone before Lorenzo realized the link was broken. The heavy silver-plated tray in Alice's hands felt like an anchor as she pushed through the double doors into the industrial kitchen. The scent of garlic and seared veal usually offered a sense of normalcy, but tonight, the air was stagnant. Lorenzo was waiting for her, leaning against a stainless steel prep table with a glass of amber liquid in one hand and a thin, rectangular file in the other. He didn't look like a man seeking a snack, he looked like an inquisitor. "You have a very quiet way about you, Alice," Lorenzo said, his voice smooth but edged with the coldness of a blade. He didn't move as she tried to pass. "My brother thinks you're a lucky charm. A girl from the streets with the eyes of a hawk. But I've always found that people who see too much usually have a reason for looking." Alice kept her gaze lowered, the submissive posture of a seasoned waitress masking the tactical tension in her muscles. "I just do my job, Mr. Piccio. I look after the people who pay my wages." "Is that so?" Lorenzo stepped into her space, the light reflecting off his gold watch as he tapped the file against his palm. "Because I had a friend in the city records office do a little digging. Your employment history at that bistro only goes back 6 months. Before that? Nothing. It's like you dropped out of the sky and landed right in front of Gastone just when he needed a guardian angel." The internal alarm in Alice's mind was screaming. Lorenzo was closer to the truth than Gastone had ever dared to look. She needed to break his rhythm, to pivot from the hawk he suspected back to the waitress he could dismiss. She forced a flush to creep up her neck and allowed her hands to tremble just enough to make the glasses on her tray rattle. "I'm sorry if my life isn't interesting enough for a file, sir," she whispered, her voice hitching with a calculated touch of hurt pride. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and brimming with a carefully manufactured vulnerability. "I moved here to get away from a man who didn't want me to have a history. I worked under the table, moved around. I didn't think having a fresh start was a crime in this house." She let a single tear escape, a performance of a woman terrified not of the mafia, but of her past. Lorenzo stared at her, his eyes searching for a crack in the mask. For a heartbeat, the air was electric with the possibility of her cover shattering. Then, he scoffed, the predatory intensity in his face replaced by a familiar, arrogant flick of his wrist. "Always a sob story," he muttered, seemingly disgusted by her perceived weakness. He tossed the file onto the table. "Get out of here. And stay in the dining room. If I catch you hovering near the private offices again, I won't be asking questions. I'll be giving orders." Alice nodded frantically and scurried past him, her heart thundering. She had survived the lens, but the margin of safety had vanished. She wasn't just a shadow anymore, she was a target. The Piccio estate was transformed into a sea of silk, gold, and whispered betrayals for the annual winter gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a deceptive glow over the ballroom, masking the cold tension that thrummed beneath the classical music. Alice moved through the crowd in a floor-length black gown, her hair still in its signature tight bun, but her eyes were scanning the room with a predator's focus. She wasn't carrying a tray tonight, she was carrying the weight of a family's survival. She kept her distance from Gastone, who stood at the center of the room, radiating an aura of untouchable authority. He looked every bit the king, unaware that his throne was rigged with explosives. Alice's gaze shifted to Lorenzo, who stood by the grand French doors, checking his watch with a frantic regularity that made the hair on her arms stand up. As the clock struck midnight, Alice noticed a subtle shift in the room's rhythm. Four men, dressed as private security but moving with the same military precision she had seen at the bistro, began to peel away from the walls. They weren't heading for the exits, they were moving into flanking positions around Gastone. Alice slipped into the shadows of a marble pillar and pulled her burner phone from a hidden slit in her dress. Her heart hammered as she saw a message flash across the encrypted channel she had been monitoring: "The shepherd is in the pen. Close the gate." It was the signal. Lorenzo caught the eye of the lead hitman and gave a sharp, imperceptible nod. The man's hand drifted toward the suppressed weapon hidden beneath his tuxedo jacket. The music seemed to fade, replaced by the deafening roar of Alice's own pulse. She had seconds. If she called the police now, the room would become a massacre before the first siren reached the gates. If she stayed silent, Gastone was a dead man. She didn't hesitate. Alice stepped out from the shadows, not as a waitress or a cop, but as the only person who could tilt the scales. She caught Gastone's eye across the crowded floor. She didn't wave or shout. She simply mirrored the gesture she had used that first night in the diner, a slow, deliberate lean, followed by a sharp glance toward the men closing in. Gastone saw it. The recognition in his eyes was instantaneous. He didn't reach for his gun, he reached for a heavy crystal decanter on a nearby table, his muscles coiling for the explosion. "Lorenzo!" Gastone's voice rang out, cutting through the music like a gunshot. The ballroom froze. The hitmen paused, their rhythm broken by the sudden directness of the man they were meant to execute. In that sliver of a second, Alice moved. She lunged toward the breaker box hidden behind the velvet tapestries, throwing the lever and plunging the house of Piccio into a terrifying, absolute darkness. The coup had begun, but Alice had just stolen the light. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating velvet that transformed the elegant ballroom into a labyrinth of panicked breathing and the scuffle of expensive shoes. Alice moved through the blackness with the ease of a ghost, her tactical training overriding the chaos. She didn't need eyes, she had mapped the room's geography hours ago. She counted the paces toward the center of the floor, her heart a steady, rhythmic drum against the backdrop of screams. A muzzle flash erupted near the French doors. A strobe light of violence. In that fraction of a second, Alice saw Lorenzo, his face twisted in a desperate snarl, aiming a suppressed pistol at the silhouette of his brother. Gastone was caught in the open, his hand reaching for a weapon he hadn't yet cleared from his holster. Alice didn't think about the badge in her locker or the protocol Miller had screamed into her ear. She lunged. She collided with Lorenzo just as the second shot rang out, the bullet whining harmlessly into the ceiling. They hit the floor hard. Alice used her momentum to twist his wrist, the sickening crack of bone followed by the clatter of the gun sliding across the marble. She followed with a precise strike to the temple, silencing the traitorous brother before he could utter a word. The side exit, Gastone. Behind the tapestry, she hissed into the dark. Emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim, eerie crimson glow over the room. Gastone stood over his brother's unconscious form, his chest heaving, his gaze shifting from Lorenzo to the woman standing before him. In the distance, the first mournful wail of sirens began to climb the hill toward the estate. Alice had called them, she had done her duty, but the police were minutes away. "Go," Alice commanded, her voice raw. "The laundry basement leads to the coal chute. There's a car waiting 2 blocks south. If you stay, Miller will have you in a cage by dawn. Gastone looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a waitress, or a spy, or a lucky charm, but as his equal in the grey shadows of the world. He reached out, his thumb brushing a streak of soot from her cheek. "Why?" he rasped. "You have the evidence. You have me." "Because the law wants a trophy," Alice replied, her gaze iron hard. "But the city needs a man with a code. And I'm no longer following the book." He nodded once, a silent, profound acknowledgement. And vanished into the shadows just as the first blue and red lights began to dance against the ballroom windows. When Miller burst through the doors with a tactical team, he found Alice J. Brooke standing alone amidst the wreckage, her dress torn and her expression unreadable. She handed him the forged documents and the recording of Lorenzo's betrayal. "Where is Piccio?" Miller demanded, looking at the empty room. Alice straightened her spine, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "He's gone, Miller. And so is the girl who worked at the bistro." She walked past him, leaving the badge on a tray of spilled champagne. She was no longer a servant of the law or a waitress in the dark, she had become something far more dangerous, a woman who knew exactly who she was.